there has been some concern about digital transformation anyway, in the sort of broader economy for years and years. Whether certain companies are moving quickly enough to that kind of reality, and I think this is just going to accelerate some of that. And even this week, you've already seen it. I mean.
Hello and welcome to a rather different Telecoms.com podcast. Everyone's working from home. Half the world's locked into their houses with crooked bits of wood hammered against the windows and doors. So we're trying to record this on Microsoft Teams. So if it's rubbish, blame Microsoft. We've got the usual suspects though. Everyone's still here. Ian and Jamie. Ian, you got a bit of a cough, but we're not too worried right now.
Yeah, trying to keep calm.
and Jamie, you seem as healthy as ever, rugby notwithstanding. Right, so I should do what we're going to talk about. So we got to talk about the latest to do with, I think we're calling it COVID-19 now instead of coronavirus. That's the official new name. Or if it's Donald Trump,
techie, doesn't it?
Some other names. You what?
It sounds more techie, doesn't it? COVID-19.
Yeah.
Very appropriate for the software age, I think.
Indeed.
Whatever happened to COVID-18?
That's a good point. Or maybe it should be COVID-19.0. So we're going to talk about that, obviously reflecting on the novel circumstances of this pod, but trying to steer it to telecom stuff, and there have been lots of adjustments and implications for the telecoms industry there. We're going to also talk about another industry that is being affected by it and is making its own adjustments, which is movies and video. And then we're going to finish talking more broadly about disruption to the industry, some of which may be being accelerated by all this crazy stuff going on. So just to remind you that if you're watching it, I think we're still going to serve up the video of us staring into our computer screens here. If you're watching it on YouTube or on Facebook or on the site, you can listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, and countless other podcasting platforms. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to try and stitch this together because we've all written loads of stories on the whole COVID-19 thing. But I suppose a most common thread has been how the telecoms industry is responding to it. I'm going to start off with a few, and then I'm going to chuck the ball to Jamie, because he's written a few, and we're just going to have to work out how we interrupt each other when we're not all sat in the same room. I should probably crack open a beer, because we're not going to let this get in the way. And Ian and Jamie, you're just going to have to do a better job of hoarding beers than you have so far. I think Pierre's got a beer, by the way, listeners. Okay, so yeah, I think one of the core stories has been bandwidth. So with everyone suddenly at home, like what we're doing now, we're currently using up bandwidth that we wouldn't have been using otherwise. And there's loads of people at home either doing teleconferencing, just working from home. I've been streaming YouTube videos while I work as well, because that's the kind of crappy attention span guy I am. I recommend the Joe Rogan with Duncan Trussell. That's quite funny. They're all dressed up in sort of World War III costumes. And so there have been some anxieties about whether the networks are going to be able to cope. I think on the whole they have, but there have been certain measures put in place, both on the supply side and the demand side. On the supply side, people like Netflix and YouTube themselves, I think, have been asked to and are largely accepting that they need to constrain high definition video. So people can still watch stuff, but HD occupies, I think, 4 to 5 times the bandwidth that SD does. So they're constraining that. And then on the supply side, Europe's been sort of allowing operators to do a bit of throttling. So there's all sorts of net neutrality laws and that sort of thing we have here that stop them from selectively throttling sources, which you generally have to approve of because you can't be being held to ransom. And they're slightly loosening those, although only a little bit. So that's just one of the things. Before I meander onto other stuff, I'll pass it on to Jamie and just ask him to sort of elaborate on some of the telecom side sort of adjustments to COVID-19 that you've been writing about, Jamie.
Yeah, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I mean, largely they haven't actually given too much information about the work that has been done on the networks. But there are a lot of people who are effectively making sort of concessions to customers and to whether they be consumer or broadband, whether they're consumer or enterprise. Some of this might be lifting caps, some of this might be free data. Sky, for instance, have made an interesting move to, and I think this is perfectly valid, allow you to pause your Sky subscription without any, or sports subscription without any penalties. But I mean, a lot of this is, I think, it's mitigation of negative customer perceptions of the brands. Everyone is starting to make their own moves, like offering, free access to NHS websites. This is all PR work, as far as I can see, and pretty much everyone is going to balance out, and everyone's going to offer the same sort of things towards the end of the month, I would say, within the next week. The big question is how much of an impact this is going to have on networks, because obviously during the day it's downtime, you might have a few home workers, but now you're going to have home workers constantly video conferencing. The workforce in the UK is probably about 35 million. So how many of those are going to be at home actually doing video conferencing, but then also kids in the background which need to be entertained. Telecom Italia was an interesting one, in that they said during the first week of their lockdown, network traffic surged by 70% in Lombardy. I don't know how much of this is attributable to gaming, but the CEO actually pointed out Fortnite and Call of Duty as two of the applications that were placing significant strain on the network. But then at the same time, you've got to think, well, networks are built for peak hours. So will the work from home, the entertain your kids from home, actually exceed the peak traffic which is going through the network in the evening? That's the big question, and they seem pretty confident that they can hold up the networks, but realistically 2-3 weeks time will tell.
Yeah, there was a statement from BT today about how they reckon they got it covered. Is that right?
Yeah, so the BT one is quite interesting, because none of the telcos until this morning have actually given any facts and figures to say this is the state of our network, this is what the challenges are going to be. And BT, the CTIO Howard Watson, came out and said, well, normal daytime traffic across the BT home broadband network is 5 terabits a second. Now, even when you add in all the home workers, you're only reaching 7.5 terabits a second peak traffic currently. Now, that'll increase as more kids are going to be in the home during the day, and also less people go into the office. But the peak during last year, with game downloads overnight and the football, the BT network was able to deal with 17.5 terabits per second. So we're not even theoretically at the 50% of the total capacity that the network can deal with. And considering, I'd say, guessing probably 70+% of broadband subscriptions in the UK run across the OpenReach network, you're probably looking at a safe scenario, and the home broadband networks should be able to stand up to it.
Cool. Yeah, I was streaming Boardwalk Empire last night, and which I recommend, by the way. It's good fun if you're in need of some box set recommendations. It's not quite as good as something like Sopranos, The Wire, that sort of thing, but it's definitely above average, and you wouldn't regret it. But yeah, that seemed to go without a hitch. A couple of times it got a bit low res, but it sorted itself out. Anyway, Ian, you've been writing a few things on light reading. One that springs to mind was you talking about this may be heralding the real dawn of the digital age. But why don't you tell us some of the stuff you've been writing about the effects that this pandemic's having on the telecoms world.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of picking up on that, I suppose, because it's driving, as we know, it's driving everybody to work at home, to study at home, and we don't know how long this is going to last. It could be weeks. Hopefully, it will be weeks, but it could be months. And obviously, businesses have to adapt in that sort of period of time. Otherwise, we can't carry on living the lives that we live, and we're going to face an even bigger problem. So, I think there has been some concern about digital transformation anyway, in the sort of broader economy for years and years. Whether certain companies are moving quickly enough to that kind of reality, and I think this is just going to accelerate some of that. And even this week, you've already seen it. I mean, my wife and my son were at home this morning doing a sort of workout routine in front of a guy called Joe Wicks, who's quite well known, I think, in the UK for doing kind of diet programs and health and fitness. But he's now set up this channel that he's going to put on every morning from 9 o'clock. And, they're already kind of standing in the lounge doing kind of push-ups and whatever they call burpees. We've got messages from the school about online learning now. My oldest son, whose kind of GCSEs are really disrupted, and we don't know what's going to happen there. But there's talk about doing seminars online next week. So it's public sector, it's private sector. I mean, there's a lot of banks coming out, obviously, with notes at the moment about, can any company be seen as one that we can invest in at the moment, or is it just doom and gloom for everyone? And they've got some positive things to say about certain organisations, the things you wouldn't even think about, like sportswear companies. They expect to do quite well because people are going to want to be comfortable in their homes, whereas people who develop kind of fashionable gear aren't in such a good position. But I mean, on the digital side, I think that it really sort of underpins how, we've been covering this sector for years, and everybody's realised that broadband's important and telecom's important. And then all of a sudden, almost overnight, it's become absolutely critical. And I think the nice thing about what you guys were just saying with, BT's network holding up so well, and so far it seems networks in Europe doing pretty well, is that this sector has come out of this so far looking so much better than just about any other part of society. And everybody's in a difficult situation, but you look at the way the supermarkets are having to cope with panic buying, and you can't even go out and get toilet roll, and you look at the way that governments are trying to fight this. And the one kind of ray of sunshine, I would say, in all of this is at least we have these kind of resilient broadband networks that we can depend on. If we were to go back 10-20 years and this had happened and people had to sit in their homes for weeks on end, there wouldn't be the same kind of option. So it's maybe there's something positive to take out of this, but I do think it's going to drive a change that even when we recover from this, and I'm still kind of hopeful that we will in the summer, that we'll come out of this and we can get on with things. I think a lot of businesses are going to find they have evolved very, very quickly. They've had to evolve very, very quickly to kind of survive and to prosper in the long run.
Well, I think that's a very important point to add into it, is that this has kind of forced the mobility trend onto companies that have been saying they've been doing it for years and years. Like, for instance, pretty much every company on the planet says that it's working for the benefit of their employees, and they're trying to encourage more mobile working and working from home. But let's be completely honest, they're not. The vast majority of these big traditional multinationals still force all their employees to come into the office every single day, and it's sort of counterintuitive to these trends that are being sort of spoken about in sort of internal comms and well-being messaging. But the fact that it's been forced on them, they have to evolve now. So hopefully this work from home, this mobility trend, which we've been talking about for so long, but realistically enterprise haven't really taken it up. That is forcing a change in society. But I mean, and then down to the point that you made, Ian, I think there's loads of companies that are going to benefit out of this very, very significantly. Just off the top of my head, you could say, well, Microsoft, first and foremost, they've got 12 million extra registered users over the past week on Teams alone. I mean, that's a massive, massive boost to their business. But then other companies like Deliveroo, I can imagine, as long as they keep going, they're going to do very well out of it. Ocado have had to shut their website down because of so much demand. But then other companies like Visa and MasterCard. Something I noticed the other day was that there was some pubs and some restaurants and some shops that weren't accepting cash anymore. So the less cash is used, the more commission the likes of Visa, MasterCard, Amex, all these companies will take for processing payments. There's a lot of companies that could benefit very significantly at this. And another one, sorry, this has just come to my head. Disney Plus is launching next week in the UK. And then all of a sudden, you've got the entire population stuck inside, probably getting bored of searching through Netflix, and because they feel that they've watched everything. Would they be willing to take a punt and spend an extra $5.99 a month on a Disney Plus subscription for the next couple of months? I'd say Disney's going to do very, very well out of it, which is quite fortunate because all their retail parts are probably going to be shut down, and their merchandising stores, and then plus all the money they're going to lose out of the cinemas as well. So I think they're, this has been a very fortuitous launch of their streaming service.
Yeah, and as you say, the gaming companies as well. Interesting that the Telecom Italia chief talked up Fortnite and Call of Duty, and there's already been a bit of a surge in Fortnite usage in our household. So I did notice that one of the sort of news items this week coming out of Asian markets was moves that some of the, I think NTT Docomo and SK Telecom and some other sort of Asian telcos moving to set up edge gaming platforms, and also making investments in gaming companies, which are things that have obviously been planned for a long time. But you could see other telcos when they talk about their diversification, I can't even say it, diversification strategies. Those are the sort of things they're going to be looking at the moment.
I mean, this is the one thing, like Microsoft is absolutely laughing coming out of the back of this. Not only is their commercial productivity suite getting picked up by pretty much every company that wants to do video conferencing. Their edge computing, their cloud business is going to be accelerated just for the reason that you said there, Ian. More companies are going to be reliant on edge and cloud capabilities. But then also their consumer-facing product is Xbox. How many more subscriptions are they going to get and in-game purchases purely because there's more people using it and they can't go down the pub?
One counter I'll say to all that, by the way, I completely agree with what both of you have been saying, but one counter to all this demand side stuff is everyone's going to be feeling pretty skint. So another adjustment we might see is companies or services that are very good at efficiency or bundling or something like that. Where things, so it's still early days, so it's really hard to tell. But I find it fascinating if you can remove yourself from the drama of the situation, your concern about elderly relatives and all that stuff, which is obviously is paramount. But just analysing it from if you imagine being a historian looking at this in 10, 100 years' time, as Jamie rightly said, extreme circumstances force people to act in a way. Businesses tend to kick the can down the road, don't they? They tend to operate on a quite short-termist, quarter by quarter, year by year basis, and they sort of put off speculative investments. They put off just normal investment because they're always chasing margin in the short term and trying to keep their share price optimal and make sure all the bigwigs get their big fat bonuses. But now, things have been forced on everyone. Also, everyone's just got an excuse for trying stuff out and it maybe not working. Like Ian, you were just talking about GCSEs. So my son's same age as yours, and the best information we're getting is they're not going to sit GCSEs this year, which will mean that they've got to find some way of guessing at what grade they would have got, which is bound to piss loads of people off. But on the flip side, for the rest of their careers, in the unlikely event that someone goes, how come you didn't do better in your GCSEs? So they've got the best excuse ever, haven't they? So there's certain bits of, there's all sorts of weird unintended consequences of the extreme circumstances we're in now. And I think, I don't disagree that all the companies and industries that you guys mentioned are probably going to do, have a better than average chance of doing well out of it. But there could be other unintended consequences that go the other way. I mean, like the one I think Ian said about sportswear companies, you might have initially thought they were going to dive because no one's playing any sport. But as you quite rightly say, what proportion of sportswear is actually bought to play sport in? Quite small. So it's just so hard to sort of second guess these things. But I think, so much is going to change. And from a journalistic point of view, it's just going to be fascinating watching it play out.
Yeah, my sort of, sorry, Jamie. I was going to say quickly, my caveat with all this, and there's a little bit of optimism, I think, in what we're saying about telecom and things doing quite well on the broadband side, and it's all holding up very well. What you were just saying, Scott, I think the concern has to be people are getting hit in a very big way, and they're looking to save money, or I already know some people who've lost their jobs as a result of what's going on, and I'm sure there are lots of people who are listening here in the same position. So the telecom companies, at some point, people are going to start looking at what they're spending, and they're going to want to look at savings. So on the one hand, you might think someone's going to upgrade to a higher speed broadband package because they're using a lot more Netflix, they're consuming a lot more data during the week. On the other hand, do they have the funds to actually do that? And then another concern, I suppose, is just on the kind of supply chain side. These companies are investing in their networks all the time. They're making improvements. There's a huge upgrade program going on in the UK at the moment, and BT's plans were to do lots and lots of work. They've got this sort of homes passed target they're trying to meet for this fibre to the home rollout that's going on. All of that's going to be challenged by what's going on, obviously. There could be labour shortages. There could be just not getting the components in. So does that have some kind of impact further on?
The other thing to consider there is, and this is something that that Vodafone has raised as well. If you want to increase capacity, you've got to give some sort of waiver to the rules and regulation of accessing sites as well. This is something that the telcos have been complaining about for years, that it's very difficult to access sites. Now, if there are going to be demands on the mobile network and capacity needs to be upgraded, they need to access these sites very quickly, and so the red tape needs to be cut down very, very aggressively. Now, I haven't actually heard anything from DCMS or Ofcom that they're actually making any sort of like moves to make it easier to access sites, but that could play a very, very significant role in improving the resilience of the networks over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, I agree, and I think one of the things about the budget statement that came out, where they came out with this announcement again about the 5 billion that's going to go into broadband, which had already been, that had already been sort of mentioned in the manifesto. But I just think it's a shame there's always a focus on money and there's not enough focus on things like, I remember being at a conference with you, Jamie, I think last year, Connected Britain, and there was someone from OpenReach there talking about all the hurdles that they face to do with things like fibre tax, and that when they have to do a rollout, they always encounter these issues with MDUs, multi-dwelling units, where there's sort of absentee landlords and they can't get access, and there's all sorts of sort of planning permission problems that hold up rollout. And it'd be nice to see the government sort of taking a look at some of this and trying to do something about that, I think, really, especially with broadband being so much more important all of a sudden.
Well, yes. I mean, this is the issue. I mean, what we're talking about here is regulatory change, and regulatory change is subject to so many different caveats and consultations. And one of the reasons, so I remember speaking to someone from Ofcom years and years ago, well, not years and years ago, but quite a while ago, and one of the things they said was these consultations take so long is that they have to build such an airtight sort of like case for making any regulatory change, that there just has to be so much legalese developed. You leave a snippet of a gap open for any miswording or a clause which doesn't make 100% sense, and you're going to have the legal vultures from the telcos swoop down. So regulatory change takes so long because there is the constant threat of legal action from the telcos. These guys don't want regulations to change except when it benefits them. If it's benefiting the consumer, the telcos don't give a monkeys. That largely erodes their profit margin. So that's one of the reasons it'll take so long. And I'm not entirely convinced it's going to be fixed in the immediate future either.
Well, your talk of legislation makes me think of some of the broader implications of what's going on. So we've had this budget where they're chucking money around everywhere. We've had various other emergency things like mortgage holidays and more sort of state bailouts of individuals, and and you can't get chucked out of your flat if you don't pay your rent and all that sort of stuff. This is obviously all going to mean a massive increase in state borrowing, which will have implications down the line. But you know, the macroeconomics of it are fascinating, because the business world is not ground to a halt, but it's slowed down to an unprecedented extent. I mean, I don't think it even slowed down like this, like after the banking crisis, the dot-com bubble burst. The dot-com bubble was a speculative bubble anyway, so that was kind of self-contained. But after the banking crisis, I don't know, there's something, the inability of everyone to even get into work is unprecedented. So so there's that macro side, and then there's the social side. So everyone knows, you know, I went to Sainsbury's this morning. I expected there to be no bog roll, no pasta, no rice, but you know, there's no tins of anything. Even the whole lager section. I just shared a photo with you guys earlier. The entire rack. This is an out of town big old Sainsbury's. There was not a tin of lager to be had. Although rather depressingly for the real ale people, that part of that's still seemed quite well stocked. So people are sort of panic buying everything, and it's easy to condemn them and call them selfish bastards. But well, there's two things about it. Firstly, the most rational part of panic buying is that we're supposed, if you know, in our household, we've got a household of 4 people. So do you, Ian. If one of us gets it, we're supposed to lock down the whole house for 14 days, aren't we? And let it run its course through all 4 of us, if it's going to, before we emerge blinking.
Miscommunication. The person who caught it only has to self-isolate for the 7 days. Yeah. Assuming that they've managed to keep themselves away from the other members of the family, because symptoms only present after 5 to 6 days. So then you've got another 7 days to sort of roll out the disease. So if you start presenting, you only have to isolate for another 6-7 days. Everyone else in your house that has to isolate for another 14 days.
Okay, cool. Yeah, fair enough. So I think that's quite rational. If you think you're going to be locked down for between a week and 2 weeks, you're going to want to make sure you got enough stuff. I think some people have probably got enough stuff to lock down for a year right now, but that's another matter. And then you get it's similar to a speculative bubble. When you go to the supermarket and you see there's nothing left, next time you see something, you're going to grab it because you don't know when your next opportunity is going to be. So then you get this sort of snowballing panic and all that sort of thing. So the societal side of it is quite worrying. But then on the plus side, I think a lot of people are going to be helping each other out. Obviously, we're helping our elderly relatives. If I've got elderly neighbours who need help, I'm going to help them. So I think in summary, one positive that's going to come from it is it's going to make a lot of people reconsider what they think is really important. In peacetime, and we've had the longest period of uninterrupted peace since World War II, if you don't count sort of things like Vietnam and the Balkans and that sort of thing, and Iraq. People get a little bit soft and a little bit complacent. I don't judge them for it. I'm certainly soft and complacent. But then something like this happens, I think it's a bit of a wake-up call societally and philosophically for everyone to sort of consider what's important. So I think that's going to be very profound as well. But lightening it up, the one interesting development which we've touched on, but now I want to sort of drill down a bit more into is the entertainment side. So a big way to contain or at least limit a pandemic is this sort of social limiting. I forget what's the word they use. Social restraint.
Distancing.
Yeah, exactly. It basically to keep away from people. And one of the ways in which people get together most, apart from being in a pub, is in the cinema. And NBC Universal, which is owned by Comcast, has decided now to make new movies, like brand new movies that you'd only previously been able to see in the cinema, available for video on demand rental. I've just seen it because Sky and Virgin have already jumped on it. It costs 16 quid for 48 hours in the UK and $20. Now, this is interesting in the context of everything we were talking about before, but if we also just view the video entertainment industry in isolation, and the cinema industry especially, this is surely really catastrophic for the cinema industry, because a good proportion of people who would have schlepped over to the cinema and bought this overpriced popcorn and all that, and big packs of Revels and all that sort of thing, are now just going to stay at home. And for a family of 4, 16 quid compared to 4 people going to the cinema is a lot cheaper. So I'm going to hand that back to you, Jamie, because you did a bit of an analysis on this stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, my take on it is that companies like Comcast, NBC Universal in particular, they don't give monkeys how people view their content, as long as the feedback and the experience is appropriate and the profit margins are maintained. So one of the reasons I think, and I haven't got any real evidence to support this, it's more of a gut feel, that the cinema has persisted over the last few years is, number one, an experience thing, nostalgia for us in particular, but then also number two, there's a stigma associated with skipping the cinema. Straight to video movies are seen as lesser than anything else. Now, if you have a look at the two points that I just said, firstly, digital natives are increasingly becoming the most important demographic of today's society. They consume content in a different way to us who were prior to the internet. Cinema numbers have massively become stagnant in terms of annual admissions over the last 10 years, even though they've been growing for the last 3 decades before that, which I think is reflective of the growing importance of digital natives. And secondly, to the second point, Netflix has been nominated for 24 Oscars at the awards this year. All you have to do to qualify for an Oscar nomination is run a film in a Los Angeles commercial cinema 3 times a day for a 7-day period. The rest of the year, the rest of the world, you can do whatever distribution you want. Netflix has been taking it directly to the consumer, but it's still collected these nominations at the Oscars. I think that idea of taking content directly to the consumer has been validated by Netflix. So if NBC can maintain profit margins while also collecting the right number of awards and maintaining an experience with the consumer, I don't see any way that they would go back to delivering the first 6 months in the cinema. Why not just give it a month run and then take it directly through the streaming channels? I think it's more profitable and it meets the demands of today's consumer that wants content everywhere and at any time. You're on mute.
Oh, sorry, I tried to click it. It went mad. Okay, don't worry, I'm going to hand it to you in a sec. I was going to ask you, Ian, whether you would be tempted to pay 16 quid for a new movie instead of taking the family to cinema.
I don't know about 16, but I'm not disagreeing with what Jamie says. I think it's interesting, the point that Jamie made about the Oscar nominations that you saw coming out of Netflix stuff this year, and for a film like The Irishman, for instance, to have been done with Netflix and with the kind of actors who were in that, Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci, made by Martin Scorsese, for a film like that to have been released on that platform at the same time as it had a very limited cinema release is massive. I think it shows that things are kind of changing. And we do, in our household, we do spend, you do get these Amazon Prime films that aren't actually, it's a slightly different model from Netflix. So you get the cinema releases coming a few weeks later and they're available for rent for say £3 or £4, very much like going out to Blockbuster in the old days and getting a video out the store. And we do that sometimes. If it's something we particularly want to see, then we'll spend £4 on I know Pierre's going to be horrified now and have some kind of meltdown that I've spent £5 or something on Thor Ragnarok, but you consider what you spend to take 3 or 4 of you to our local cinema in Wandsworth. I think it's £10 for an adult, maybe £8 for a child. So you're talking, you know, best part of 40 quid to take a family out. So yeah, so I completely agree. I think this is another one of those examples of changes that are already happening, but you know, given what's going on at the moment in the world, it will be massively accelerated.
And I think for the actual content creators, I think this makes a lot more sense as well, because it used to be, when you actually look at, you know, cinema admissions being incredibly high, that would be the way that you generated a huge amount of income, you know, from the box office. But the box office isn't growing in the same way that it did before, yet the cost of developing a movie is shooting up, especially when you consider CGI. You've got to make it HD compatible. Some of them are 3D. That means extra cost as well. You know, there's a huge amount of cost. So why not go directly to the consumer if you can actually validate the model? And you know, I think £16 is probably too much. But when you go across to the US, they're used to paying extortionate amounts for content and for connectivity anyway. So maybe that's more of an acceptable price there. You know, I just cannot see how anyone can go back to. The other thing to consider is the accessibility of content. Netflix is on every smart TV now. It's embedded into Sky. Amazon is the same. You know, accessing this content through high-speed networks, it does actually work. You can build this, you know, home cinema type experience in your home, because electronic goods are becoming commoditized as well. So everything is working against the cinema, I think, and it's all down to, number one, the way that you can deliver the content, which is through online and in the cloud. Number two, high-speed networks are enabling you to stream consistently HD content. And number three, money. You know, it probably is going to be more financially beneficial to deliver it straight to the consumer as opposed to going through the cinema.
So the only counter I'll give to the money side, as per what Ian just said about Thor Ragnarok. And by the way, Ian, I'm pretty sure that Pierre only watches black and white films with people in berets smoking gitan and philosophizing. But if he had a lapse and went for Thor Ragnarok, yeah, he might be inclined to wait even longer until it's a quid or two cheaper. And the point I'm trying to make there, other than to troll Pierre, who's muted and can't defend himself, is that you get this drop off. You get this sort of reverse exponential drop off, don't you? 16 quid on day one, month later it's half that, month later it's half that, and so on. So you've only got to wait 2 or 3 months, and you're paying a fraction of what you would to get it straight away. It's the classic sort of early adopter thing, but even more exaggerated in the form of digital content. So that's the only thing I'll say in response to Jamie's good points about the economics, certainly being on the side of the content producers and distributors, and certainly not on the side of cinemas, is, you know, maybe not that many people will pay the 16 quid, and maybe a lot of people will think, I can wait a month and pay 8 quid. Let's see how it goes, but I'm sure they'll be spending a lot of time obsessing about new commercial windows and all that sort of thing, and they'll get it right. But I think we can all agree that this probably isn't a time to invest in cinema stock. Right. So yeah, I think the broad theme of this pod's been disruption, and there's one more topic to do with disruption, not necessarily as sort of directly related to the pandemic as other ones, but I'm sure there'll be a feature of it, and that's disruption of network technologies, basically. And we've spoken about this a few times, and two spring to mind. One is the OpenRAN movement, if we can call it that. Well, that sounds a bit sort of studenty, doesn't it? But the movement towards sort of commoditizing the technologies within the radio access network, which is disruptive, which is especially disruptive to the big kit vendors, and the operators are quite enthusiastic about, because they can see how this would save them a few quid. And also in the era of demonizing Huawei, it's a way of being less dependent on any incumbent vendor for your stuff. So yeah, Telefonica has got in bed with a few other sort of non-traditionally telco, or at least ones that don't come up prominently in what we talk about, people like Intel, to have a little look at that, and I'll ask Jamie to comment on that in a sec. And then the other big disruption is Rakuten, the new Japanese vendor, new Japanese operator, which has just gone for all the bells and whistles. It's a greenfield network built from scratch, all the latest stuff, and it's a complete shop window for how to do it. And that it could actually disrupt markets beyond just the Japanese one, with other people being able to copy it, in some ways even buy the kit from it. But first, I'll ask Jamie to comment a little bit more on that sort of Telefonica story. It was you that covered it, wasn't it? I'm not going mad.
No, it wasn't me.
It wasn't you.
No.
Maybe it was me.
I mean, I can talk
Christ.
about OpenRAN if you want.
Well, let me. Yeah. Well, I mean, let me summarize it. Yeah, it probably was me. I don't even know what day of the week it is right now, if I'm honest. But yeah, basically, the most interesting thing. Do you know it was me? I remember writing it now. For God's sake. The most interesting thing about it for me when I wrote it, which I remember doing, was that they reckoned that they were going to actually be trying out OpenRAN in the field this year. So this is Telefonica getting involved with people like Intel, Altiostar, a few other sort of relatively behind the scenes technology companies. And they reckon they're going to try it out. And the reason that was significant is, like, for example, Ian, you remember when we were at the Ericsson briefing and me and Ray were hassling the Ericsson guy about OpenRAN and trying to get him to comment on it. And one of the things he said to me was, basically, he was a bit dismissive, saying it's not really viable. And of course, they would say that. But, if Telefonica can manage, COVID-19 notwithstanding, to actually try the stuff out this year, it could become a reality a lot more quickly than we think. So I mean, either of you can comment on that as I sort of cocked up the who wrote it thing. But if anyone else has got anything to comment on the whole Telefonica thing and OpenRAN, then go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I've got some sympathy with, obviously Ericsson is being, in that example, they're being defensive because this is going to disrupt their revenue cycle. But I have got some sympathy with them when they're saying that OpenRAN isn't ready and isn't going to make that much of an impact in the immediate future. Because if you actually look at the products that are being offered and being created by the likes of Ericsson, Nokia, Huawei, even when you go into different parts of the network, like Cisco and those sorts of other companies that we don't mention that often, they've been working on these technologies for 10 years. OpenRAN has only really been sort of put in the field and actually tested over the last 6 to 7 months. You're not going to get market resilience through these OpenRAN products until they have been sort of like tested in every scenario and every different twist and nuance on traffic type and encryption level and surge and peak and low and high. That's what these traditional products have. They have resilience and they have confidence from the telcos, and that's what OpenRAN doesn't have. So yes, I think it's going to be a remarkable revolution, and especially as sort of 5G and sort of like more networks are driven by software, the likes of Nokia, Ericsson, Huawei become less influential on the industry. But it'll be a long time before that happens, I think. Ian, do you want to add?
Yeah. I mean, I can come in because I wrote something on a very related. I mean, you mentioned Rakuten there, and I, at long last, after weeks of hassling them about trying to chat to their CTO, managed to get some phone time with him this week. And it's a guy called Tarek Amin, who I've seen him speak several times. I've written about him a few times, and he's arguably possibly the most exciting technology executive in the industry at the moment. He's a person that everybody sort of wants to hear from and talk to and hear about, because they're kind of really in the vanguard of this. So, as you said, Scott, they're building this greenfield network in Japan using not only OpenRAN. I mean, the entire network is built using software-based cloud-native technologies, or that this is their claim anyway, and so it's kind of a real test case for the reason it's attracted so much interest is, as Jamie says, these older networks, these traditional networks have a reputation, they've got resilience, they've got, they're a kind of proven thing, and no one's really seen OpenRAN in action in a kind of mass market environment, especially not in a highly developed market like Japan. So what Rakuten's doing is it's kind of the first test case for all this stuff, and they're due to launch really, really soon. They've got their 4G service launching, I think, on April the 8th is the exact date, and then they're following that up with a few weeks later with a 5G launch, which, as I kind of found out during my chat with him, is also, this is an OpenRAN launch. This is doing things like massive MIMO and sort of very, very high speed services using this kind of disaggregated model. So this separation between hardware and software that everybody talks about, they're using the same software company to do all the RAN software, which is Altiostar, which they have a majority stake in that. And then they can sort of use hardware from a selection of vendors with that. So they have Nokia on the 4G side, they're using NEC and a company called Airspan on the 5G side, and you get this kind of ability to mix and match vendors in a way you didn't get before. And there's a lot of skepticism about what they were doing, which is he's always very, very sort of keen to rebuff these complaints that come in from the industry and from a lot of analysts saying, they don't see it working, they don't see necessarily the cost savings, and he's always very kind of keen to sort of put his point as to why it will. And he's a pretty compelling guy. I mean, he's very cool, he's very kind of confident and articulate speaker, and he's got some really sort of interesting statistics that to tell you about. I mean, one of the things I was fascinated with is the amount of people they have on the operations side, and also how many they think that's going to grow to. So because they've built this thing from scratch and they don't have all these legacy OSS platforms that have kind of sprung up over the years, and it's extremely streamlined, they only have about 175 people at the moment, and he doesn't see that getting any bigger than 350 on the operations side. And I said to him,
that's one point that you really should labour, and I think that's the why Rakuten can do this, is that they are building the perfect scenario network. They don't have legacy technologies. And I think this should be reiterated and stressed to anyone that's listening or anyone who's thinking of or interested in OpenRAN. Rakuten is building perfect scenario network for the 21st century and 5G from the ground up. No one else in the world can do this. Maybe it's the only other company that I can think of off the top of my head which has got the scale, and the money to do this is Dish over in the US, becoming the fourth operator replacing Sprint. But I think that's something. I think these OSS networks are legacy products. I think that's something that should be reiterated and stressed constantly with ORAN.
Yeah, and Dish is interesting because Dish is heavily basing its whole sort of modus operandi on what Rakuten's doing. I mean, they seem to be using Rakuten as a kind of model for what they want to do. So if they can do the same thing, and I asked him how many people would you normally have in Japan, on a fully deployed network on the operations side, and he said, well, he didn't have an exact number, but it would at least be in the thousands. So it's a massive difference between 350 and the thousands. And if Dish can do the same kind of thing in the US, then that's going to be extremely disruptive. But the commercial advantage it gives them is that what Rakuten's doing on the pricing side is to basically launch these services with tariffs that are massively discounting to what you'd pay Docomo, let's say, or SoftBank or KDDI. They're about half as much. So they're promising to kind of pass this on to consumers. And as I say, it hasn't been tried and tested yet. So everybody's waiting to see what actually happens. The points Jamie made about the resilience of the network are going to be really important because the kit they're using, a lot of the kind of tools that they're using when they're actually designing and developing hardware and putting it out there are things that we've not seen commercially before. And there's lots of concerns about whether that really measures up performance-wise. And he pretty much admitted this himself. He said, some of these things that Ericsson said in the past about general purpose processors, for instance, not measuring up to their kind of customized gear because the baseband computing costs are much higher. This is still something that people like Tarek and other people involved in OpenRAN acknowledge is a hurdle that needs to be overcome. His point is that you can sort of offset that to some extent with the savings you make in other areas. So one interesting thing they're doing, for instance, is, the radio sites themselves are really light compared to what you normally have. They only have a radio, basically an antenna, and all the sort of baseband stuff and a lot of other cabling, a lot of other stuff that you normally get at radio sites is all pulled back into these edge data centers. So one thing that I think concerned analysts is whether you really do get savings when you're actually building out this infrastructure, because you still need to send labor teams out, you still need to actually put it all up. So his point is, well, you do, because you're just not putting anywhere near as much stuff out. The time it takes to get these things up is so much quicker. It's not as much of a kind of extensive job. So he makes a very convincing case for it.
I think the other point to add into there is that yes, they have to build edge infrastructure, support all these sort of lightweight and sort of scaled back sort of cell sites, but that's not necessarily a cost saving or cost expense, because every other telco is having to build out their edge capabilities as well. So Rakuten might be spending a bit more on their edge capabilities, but that's not to say that any of the other telcos aren't spending that at the same time. So it's not necessarily additional expense, because they'd have to do it anyway if they did it the traditional net deployment way.
Yeah, well, his point is more on the sort of savings on the radio side there, really. Obviously, they still have a lot of edge data centers, and there is going to be investment there. But I think a lot of the costs in terms of erecting the actual sites, and there are thousands of these, obviously, around the country, is on having to put so much equipment up. So that's where he's sort of looking for savings there. But I mean, he's a really interesting guy to talk to, and he's very closely watched. It's just whether, he's going to be under a lot of pressure in the next few months when this stuff starts to go live, because everybody's going to be looking at that network to see whether it really does measure up, and any kind of signs of problems, people will be leaping on them. So he's going to be under a lot of pressure, but he's a pretty cool and calm character, and he's already had some success in the Indian market. He was the guy who was actually CTO for Reliance Jio before he left to move to Rakuten. So that network is not as greenfield perhaps as the Rakuten one. It's Rakuten's even more ambitious than what Jio's done, but you see the impact that Jio's had in the Indian market, and admittedly that was a market that was was ripe for disruption, perhaps much more than Japan is, but he's got a good track record there, and if he can do the same kind of thing in a developed market, then a lot of people are going to be looking at this stuff a lot more seriously, I think.
Yeah, well, that's the thing about disruption, as we touched on earlier on a broader scale with the COVID-19 thing. But when something comes along, not only does it force people to react and adapt, but it also sets new precedent. And so until someone like Rakuten just tries stuff out. So we've been writing for years about NFV, virtualization, all this sort of stuff, and it all looked great on PowerPoint. But I got the impression that the industry was a bit gun shy to actually take the first jump. So now you've got this example of someone's taken the first jump. All the people assessing risk can go, well, this is how it actually happened in practice. And it turned out this went well, this didn't go well. So then suddenly CTOs can go to their board and go, look, I've actually got a risk assessment on this stuff now. And this is some evidence that says this is worth shelling out the wedge. So I think that's interesting. And then just one other thing, and we're getting close to sort of wrapping up soon. Yeah, go ahead, Jamie.
Just to add on to what you said, I mean, I completely and utterly agree with you, but it's just dawned on me again. This is the telecommunication industry not learning lessons of yesteryear. I mean, we complained God knows how many times. I got Paolo calling me. We complain so often. Oh no, I'm not answering it. But if he watches the podcast now, he knows why I screened his call. I did say to him to call after 3:30 though. Everything from yesterday, we said, the reason the telcos were so heavily disrupted is because they weren't aggressive enough in developing their own ecosystems, whether it's for content, whether it's, being disrupted by WhatsApp because they got their SMS and their voice messages killed off, or when you look at the smart home, the internet players got in there to own the ecosystem because the telcos weren't aggressive enough. Is the same going to happen for the connected cars? What this is inactivity and the inability to do something new by the traditional telcos, and they're probably going to be disrupted again. So in this case, it's NTT Docomo, it's KDDI. I can't think what the other operator is actually in Japan. SoftBank, that's the one. They're going to be disrupted by or potentially disrupted by an aggressive player because their culture is too traditional and allowing other people to make the promising strides forwards.
And one last thing, Ian. I think it was Mike that covered this for light reading, but it looks like Rakuten, once this thing is sort of mature, is planning to sort of in some way sell or license or help out other people with their builds. Did you catch what that plan is?
Yeah, they have. That is a story that Mike wrote and that I didn't track as closely. But they have a series of tools, sort of online tools, really, that I think they're looking to package up and potentially provide to telcos and other markets. And a kind of candidate for this, obviously, as we were saying, is Dish, because they seem to be fairly closely connected with Rakuten. They're tracking them and looking to them as a kind of model for how they want to do things. So they were kind of called out, I think, specifically in Mike's story, which I'm just looking at now. Yeah, so it's the plan. It's later this year they're planning on doing this. Is to take the sort of cloud platform that they've got, which they call the Rakuten mobile platform, and then kind of deploy that as a private cloud for possible future partners. So it would make it easier to kind of deploy telco networks in the future in a kind of sort of click, purchase, deploy sort of way. It kind of moves them into that vendor market to some extent, I suppose, which they already occupy more than a lot of other operators, simply because they have this ownership stake in Altiostar. So they're already becoming a lot more active in terms of technology development and have a kind of slightly vendor role anyway. But this would sort of it would kind of accelerate that to some extent.
And they're presumably developing their own sort of virtual network functions and other clever software things, which they can then stick in this long fabled VNF sort of marketplace where you just buy stuff off the peg, so to speak. So that's yet another point of disruption they're going to do. Okay, Jamie, do you have any last stuff you want to say before I wrap it up?
No.
Okay. So well, I think that went all right, lads, considering it's all a bit weird. We even got some live footage of Jamie walking through his flat to go vaping out the window, which was a real highlight for me. So thank you very much, guys, for adapting. Thank you to our audience, assuming we still have one. We probably have a bigger one than ever, actually, for adapting as well. And it's going to be like this for the foreseeable future, so I hope it was tolerable for you. Thanks for listening. Make sure you join us for the next one.